You're listening to a CNA podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Deep Dive. For all of you Stephen Chia fans, I have to tell you that he's filming in Madrid, Spain. From his social media, he is enjoying the sunshine and the good food, but of course, he's also doing some work. But I hope you'll stay for this one because it affects not just a sizable group of workers here in Singapore, but I would say it affects every single one of us as well. How many times this week have you ordered food via an app? Something delivered to your home, or jumped into a car that you booked that came to pick you up right from your doorstep? Called platform workers, this group has ballooned significantly. There are now about 70,500 of them in Singapore, and it has changed a lot of lives, but there are some downsides that have crept in. Injuries tend to be commonplace because they're out and about and always on the move. Many of them also don't have enough in their CPF, and they come up short when they need to buy homes or they need to retire. On Tuesday, the 10th of September, the Platform Workers Bill was passed. Now, this is quite a landmark bill. Singapore is the first one to do it, and it legislates stronger protections for this group. So, we agree that protecting this group is the right thing to do, but what does it mean for them in the long run? And for companies and for us? Will it make our delivery dinners more expensive? Joining me online are Ms. Yeo Wan Ling. She's the Assistant Secretary General of NTUC. Hi, Wan Ling.
Hello, good morning.
And our good friend of Deep Dive, Associate Professor Walter Theseira from the Singapore University of Social Sciences. Hi, Walter.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here.
Okay, let's get right in. The first question that came to my mind when I was thinking about this topic, the idea of platform workers sounds new. But frankly, there have been people in our community, in our society that have done this work for a very long time. I can think of taxi drivers, hawkers, private tutors. They had the choice to contribute to their CPF. MediSave top-ups were the thing that they did, right?
That's right.
So what do you think has changed in the last 5 years since the entry of these tech companies and platforms like Gojek, Grab, and Lalamove?
It's great that you framed the problem as one where this kind of work has been around for a long time. And indeed, self-employment has been an important feature of our economy. A lot of people actually prefer it because of the flexibility it offers. But there's one particular issue that has come up in recent years with platform work. It makes it a bit different from the self-employment of the past. And that is the fact that the platform companies actually act as an intermediary where they actually control to a very large extent the kind of work that these self-employed persons do. Your traditional hawker or taxi driver, they could set their own hours, choose how and when to work and so on. But with platforms, the platforms actually exercise quite a lot of control over the platform workers. So that's one thing. So the nature of the relationship is no longer one of arm's length self-employment. You do what you want. You're actually controlled by the platform to a large extent. The other issue I would be cautious about is that the platforms, by introducing this easy alternative for many companies and consumers to use the services of a self-employed worker, they're actually changing your job ecosystem in quite, I would say, a possibly dangerous way. They have the potential of taking jobs which are in fact today regular employment and converting them to this kind of platform of self-employment, because by doing so, they may offer firms and consumers lower costs. Why do I say lower costs? Because CPF isn't going to be paid, because some protections aren't going to be offered. That danger is what this bill is responding to, actually.
Right. What about you, Wan Ling? You meet a lot of these people. So
That's right.
Tell me a little bit more about how this entire ecosystem that Walter is talking about has changed.
Well, you're absolutely right. The NTUC has been representing the self-employed for a very long time. Before this, the National Taxi Association has been around since 2010.
Yep.
And actually, even before 2010, the National Taxi Association was actually made up of branches of workers who were working in individual taxi companies. And we aren't unfamiliar with the issues that our self-employed and gig economy workers are actually facing. But you are also absolutely right that over the last 5 to 7 years, the landscape has changed quite a lot. Firstly is the introduction of the tech companies. And with these tech companies coming in, there's actually new evolving ways of business models.
Right.
The evolving business models change day by day, week by week. And because of this, it does affect our workers, the drivers and riders who are practicing with them.
You gave an example in Parliament, Wan Ling, about somebody who was not able to book the peak hour shifts, etc.
Yeah, that's right. So what happens was, in that particular instance, we had a rider who has actually been food delivering for a couple of years, always using a power-assisted bicycle. And,
Yep.
he's always been able to get his shifts and all that, which, back to what Walter has talked about, there are a lot of management controls put on our gig platform workers. Essentially, you think that, they can choose the times that they want to work and all that, but it's actually constrained because you have to go on the app to book certain shifts. And it's open at certain hours, and you have to make sure that you're in to get the best bookings.
Right.
But anyway, what happens was he's always been doing those kind of shifts, using his PAB. And one day he realized that he wasn't able to book his shifts as usual, which is very, very concerning because at the end of it all, this is the way that he makes his livelihood. And he's a 100% delivery rider.
Right.
And he played around, of course, with the app and realized that the same shifts were actually open for bicycles. That means not power assisted. So it's the lack of transparency for many of our riders. I do think more needs to be done, and I don't think livelihood should be as precarious as the changing priorities of our platforms.
Okay, let's come back to exactly what these protections are meant to do, right?
Yeah.
So I was quite surprised actually to read that in a 2021 Ministry of Manpower survey that the medium take-home salary of platform workers is below the bottom 20th percentile of all full-time resident self-employed persons. So you read in the papers about people making $5,000, $7,000, and I'm thinking that's not consistent. So if you really look at it over a long term, this is not as good as it sounds.
Absolutely. I think we have to start from the basis that platform work is, unfortunately, generally fairly low-skilled work.
Yeah.
In fact, that's why it is possible for it to be intermediate using a platform, because the platform basically doesn't really have much barrier to entry. Anybody can sign up for it. There are no particular skills you need. Now, all of this, is not to say that the work is bad work or anything like that. I mean, obviously, people who are doing the work are doing an honest job and they're earning for their families. But the reality is, because of the fairly low skill level and the ease of entry, the wages for these kinds of jobs will, I would say, fall to the level required to get anybody to join. And that's the problem here. So it's not well remunerated work. The second issue is that the earnings, however, do depend on how much you want to work and what kinds of shifts and jobs you want to take up. We do see that it is possible for people to earn a more decent amount, but the only way they're going to be able to do that is they have to push themselves really hard. They have to work much more than what people would consider reasonable working hours. They have to definitely sacrifice weekends, all the peak periods and things like that to do the job.
Yeah.
So when you look at the earnings as a whole, it's a wide distribution. You might have reasonable earnings for people who push themselves really hard, but they might be not able to sustain that over the long run, especially as age and health issues and so on catch up. You also have a pretty large tail of lower earnings, but lower earnings is not always bad because the platform workers are doing it because they're filling in time from another job,
Right.
or perhaps they are caregivers and they can only work a couple of hours a day. In this case, getting a few $100s is much better than getting zero. So I think we have to appreciate that as well.
That's right. I wanted to break down this group, right? It was very clear during the discussion in Parliament that this is certainly not a homogeneous group, right? It's very wide. On the one hand, you have very young people who come in and they do it in between other kinds of freelance work, but quite a big number of them are people who don't really have a choice. They are people in their 40s to 50s, perhaps being let go. Wan Ling, do you see that becoming more common?
I would say, if I break it down, it would be people who do this on a full-time basis and people who do this as a supplementary income type.
Right.
The supplementary income type, I see this done with a lot of the younger people or maybe retirees. They just want to make sure, that with the free time, they're able to do a side gig, a side hustle.
Yeah.
But the worrying part comes with the full-timers.
Okay.
And for the full-timers, a lot of them are people who are about to start families or who have very young families and they're getting into long-term financial commitments.
Right.
Just adding to what Walter had talked about just now, a lot of times incentives comes as a very big part of the total package that they take back. But incentives are also something that changes all the time.
Yeah.
I remember when the platforms first started coming to Singapore, they had really big incentives going on.
Oh, yeah.
I think it was around the time of Singapore's birthday. If you did 50 trips, you could get like a 50-inch TV and all that kind of stuff. But it's dangerous when you count incentives and campaigns in as a part of what your livelihoods are. If you have long-term commitments, if you're starting a family, that's probably when you'll start to purchase a HDB home. And that's when your monthly commitments need to come in. You need to pay for your mortgage, your kids' education and all that. This is the part where we think a lot more clarity needs to be coming in. It's important that our gig platform workers are also looking at clarity when it comes to building their nest eggs. And therefore, I think CPF is actually very important.
That's a good segue. Let's talk about the CPF component. I was struck by the age at which they say it's mandatory and it's not. So this will kick in on January 1st next year. It's mandatory for those 30 and below. And I think this is who you are talking about, right?
Yes, that's right.
But why 30? There might be those between 40 to 50 who also have these commitments too. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Choice is important. And as you mentioned, the range of workers are actually very wide. For a lot of the younger workers that we speak to, they are very welcoming of the CPF because it does allow them to bring back a larger pay package, because right now, rightfully, if they're employee-like, you should be getting CPF rights. With this, you're looking at an additional 17% when this thing rolls out to its entirety.
Yep.
But also at the same time, we also have a substantive group of people who are actually quite okay and quite secure. For instance, our taxi drivers.
Yep.
They probably have their homes all fully paid up and all that. And, we just want to give people the option to be able to opt in. I've been hearing that a lot of the taxi drivers are also wanting to be part of this program because it does add to maybe not the retirement adequacy part, but definitely the healthcare part.
Tell me a little bit more about this, because they do build their nest egg, but you know how it is, right? They already make not very much. So now with the CPF thing, they're going to take home less. So that's obviously the thing that stares in their face.
I want to approach this from a couple of angles. I think first off, anytime a discussion of CPF contributions is made, in the context of self-employed workers, I would say generally self-employed workers always get a bit nervous because they realize that making more CPF contributions means that their take-home goes down. For many of them, because the work is not super well paying, they are finding that their budget is already quite stretched with their take-home. So it's natural for them to wonder what's going to happen when 20% starts going into my CPF account. So that's one issue, of course.
Yeah.
The other issue I would note, and this relates to actually the choices that these workers have, right? The interesting problem to me is that while a lot of platform work is low skill, actually the workers themselves are not low skill. A considerable amount of the platform workers, in fact, have got qualifications or skills that would allow them to take up CPF paying jobs with a better career trajectory. But I suspect that at least for some fraction of them right now, one of the reasons why they don't do that is because the take-home pay from platform work looks too attractive compared to some of these other jobs out there, which would require and use their skills, but have a career ladder, a skills ladder that they're going to end up earning more eventually. But the problem is, for the first couple of years, it doesn't look so attractive, taking up the first rung of this ladder, and that's when they go into platform work. And part of what has to happen here is that the balance between the attractiveness of platform work and these viable careers has to change,
Right.
And I think this bill goes a bit of a way towards doing that. And, although they might be not very happy perhaps in the first 1 or 2 years about this, if they switch to these jobs with a better career runway and skills ladder, they will be much better off. Their families will be better off in 5 or 10 years' time for sure. So I think that's what we have to think about as well.
The government has said that it's going to help them. It's going to mitigate some of this fear about less take-home cash. Do you think that's sustainable? I know it's a tiered thing where it'll become less and less over the years. Eventually, they will have to get used to it. How does that work from a systems perspective?
Well, what happens, right, is that this is a tripartite discussion. It started off being a tripartite discussion, and I think, right, the operationalization of it will also be tripartite. In this end, the government has stepped in with a package to help both our workers as well as companies transit into this, and I think it's quite long-term. It's a 5-year rollout.
Yeah.
And the other thing too, it's also important that our consumers also know that there is this group of workers out there that need to be paid fairly But it is also important that our platforms pay for their fair share. The unions are also keeping an eye out on how this will actually pan out. Our workers always tell me this, that the 羊毛出在羊身上, which actually in English it means the wool must come from the sheep's body. And it's important that at the end of it all, our workers aren't the ones who are bearing for the cost of the CPF. So it is important that everybody pays fairly for their share of the CPF.
So including us, right? We have to contribute to the wool as well and be prepared to pay more?
I would say that it is being prepared to pay for the business costs of such a model. If you think about this, our employees here have been working in employee-like type of work arrangements for many years. And they have gone these many years without CPF as well. It is time to regularize this. It's time to normalize this for the business models of platform companies, especially in Singapore, where CPF is something that is mandatory for employees.
Yeah, and also very central to our lives in terms of retirement, housing, etc. Okay, so let's move on to wrap up and move into a little bit more philosophical in terms of this whole thing, right? Somebody wrote a letter to the Straits Times and he was saying that housing and retirement adequacy is something that we as employees, whether we are platform workers or not, need to sort out. To quote, housing and retirement adequacy, the platform workers need to sort out their priorities themselves, and the state should not be expected to bear the cost of this social justice, close quote. And that was what he was getting at. I've been seeing a lot more of this, where even people my age who've been working maybe for employers for quite some time now decide to do fractional work. It means they have different contracts with different people. Should they be the ones to take care of their own retirement adequacy? What do you guys think?
That's what CPF is all about, isn't it? So CPF, right, has a component where you have to take care of it, but also at the same time, right, for the type of work that you're putting in, it needs to be fairly paid for by your employer or the platforms that you actually partner with and work with. This is actually an evolving business model that has come up very, very strongly over the last 5 to 7 years. A sizable portion of our workforce are actually part of this now. And it's like what you said, it might start with our drivers and riders now, but eventually, right, the law is broad enough for this to cover all platforms. As the aspirations of Singaporeans change, the way that we're looking towards a more flexible work that is a little bit more dynamic, I think it's important that the government as well as the labour movement does pay attention to this, and which is something that labour movement has been monitoring for many, many years. This led to the pushing and the advocacy of this bill, because it will affect the lives of Singaporeans, the way that Singaporeans are choosing to do this type of work, but also at the same time, the way that our business models, companies, whether or not they're local or foreign, are coming into Singapore to embark on this.
Walter, what do you think?
I think we take a step back, right? I think in almost every society I can think of, pretty soon, once that society is formed or governments gain independence, workers tend to demand some kind of better protection for their long-term security and rights. So, they tend to demand, for example, better health protection, better retirement security, housing security, and so on. So typically the way that countries and companies respond to those requirements is they come up with plans to provide for the workers in their old age or when they're infirm and so on. And of course, these plans do involve setting aside some money from when the workers are still able and earning and so on for later on, right? It's just a matter of how you do it. Do you do it, for example, through a CPF system like what we have in Singapore? Or do you do it through a pension system where perhaps the way that the money is taken out is a bit more opaque, as is frequently the case? The question is, why do we do it, right? Why don't the workers just do it themselves? There are a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that, frankly, for a lot of us, right, I'm not just talking about workers abstractly, I'm even talking about you and me when we were 20-something or in our early 30s. Are we really going to have the presence of mind in our early 20s to start saying, I'm going to start setting aside 5, 10%, 20% of my income today in order to save for my housing retirement? No, I mean, a lot of us, if we're honest ourselves, we wouldn't have done this when we were 21, 22, whatever, right?
Course,
And we would have put it off for many years. The problem is we would have likely put it off until it's far too late. And then we realize, all of a sudden we cannot afford whatever it is we need for our families and so on.
Right.
Without CPF policy, policy in place, and of course HDB and so on, I am convinced that we would not have, like majority home ownership in Singapore today. Just look at other countries which do not actually have a program for their citizens to set aside money for housing and so on. They don't end up with universal home ownership. Now, is that a good or bad thing? I mean, it depends on your point of view, but we wouldn't have, the kind of housing security we have in Singapore today without CPF. And as much as people don't like the idea that their money has to be set aside, if something happens to them, right? If they lose their jobs or they have kids or whatever, and they realize, oh, I'm sitting in my house, which is largely paid for through CPF, and I don't have to come up with money immediately right now to suddenly scramble for this and so on. That's when they do appreciate it. And, perhaps they didn't when they were 20-something, but they do appreciate it a bit later in their life, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know what? I think philosophically it's also about how do you recognize and treat this growing class of workers. This is where the state needs to come in. If, let's say, business models are evolving and they have become more employee-like, then yes, I need to classify them as that. And it's not just only Singapore that's grappling with this.
Yep.
If you look right throughout the whole entire world, there is a rise of the sharing economy, the gig platform economy. There are places where they recognize them as pure employees. But there are places too where they are still wondering where the needle will end, in the classification of this new type of workers. And therefore, right, it is important. And this bill was quite interesting because I think Singapore is the first in the whole world to recognize them as employee-like, thereby recognizing both the fact that they are gig economy workers, they are self-employed, but also at the same time subjected to management control by the platforms that they work with.
Dr. Danny Kwah, he wrote this paper, and one of the things he said, which I agree with, is protecting platform workers is not just for platform workers. His argument is that it will help Singapore society manage all these disruptions that are coming. Any last thoughts, Walter?
Just to build off on what Prof. Danny Kwah was suggesting, I think he's right to identify that, especially as we have new technologies, new forms of business disruption, as well as, I would say, preferences by workers, perhaps for more flexible work arrangements, we may well see that more of the kind of work we do, including much higher skill work, is actually increasingly arranged on platforms. And that's why I think it's in all our collective interest to ensure that we have a much better regulated and I think fairer system for doing so. I would also say, of course, that there is also work that we don't want transferred to platforms because it's perfectly well done right now under an employment or other arrangement. But we also don't want to give then incentives to businesses to cheapen out, to lower their business costs by shifting the workers to platforms as well. So I think making the system fairer, making the business costs, I think, fair on all sides, not just for the platforms, but also for your traditional employees. I think that's really important. And I hope that this bill, when it's implemented, actually goes a long way towards doing that.
Okay, Wan Ling?
Well, I think at the heart of this is actually fairness for both, right, our workers as well as the business models. For a lot of gig economy workers, they kind of have lost a lot of voice that they might have, partly because, right, they are individuals. And a lot of times, right, as an individual, when you do meet with certain issues, whether or not, right, it is issues on your delivery, whether issues on the app, glitches and all that kind of stuff, it's kind of difficult for one person to tell a giant, I have issues, with your app, or I have issues with your campaigns because I'm not making as much and all that. And therefore, I think it's very timely for us to have a collective voice for our gig platform workers because the things that happen to them do matter. Singapore being a very cosmopolitan, a place where people want to invest in, there will always be disruptions. There will always be new ways of doing things. It is important for us in the wake of this as a whole collective Singapore in our social compact that we don't look at our laws, we don't look at the way that we treat workers as static. It needs to be changed all the time. There needs to be ways in which we react and also prepare for how businesses are coming to invest in Singapore. And it goes back to ensuring that this is a good place for people to invest in, but balancing this also right with the rights of Singaporeans.
Thank you very much, both of you. I would say that, yes, I feel like this is quite an important bill. Personally, I'd be prepared to pay more because without this army of folks who toil every single day, making our lives very convenient, I can't imagine life now, right, without having all these services. So thank you for coming. Thank you to the team as well. Junani Johari, Tiffany Ang, Joanne Chan, Saya Win, To Yen Yun, and Sound mixing is by Ken Delbridge. Thank you, everyone. See you next week when Steve and I will be back.